Hi there, and welcome along to the Gardener Ben podcast and episode 3. My favourite time of the year has arrived once more, and you might think that's a strange thing for a gardener to say, but autumn planting season is by far my favourite. I absolutely adore planting bulbs and getting the garden ready for next year. I'm always around 1 or maybe 2 seasons ahead of where the garden currently is. And sometimes that can lead to the fact that I don't really overly enjoy the season that we're in. So I need to sometimes just stop and take a moment to stand and in the garden, just have a good look around and enjoy the beauty that's to be seen. But at this time of year, as the beauty starts to fade from the garden and the colours start to change, it's the perfect time to start thinking about preparing for next season. And that for me really goes hand in hand with planting of new plants. If there's a plant in the garden that's failed, something's got too large, maybe it has naturally died, or something is not bringing you a great deal of joy. Or, for instance, like me, you may have planted something in a spot where it doesn't particularly like, or it's causing a little bit of a problem with a colour clash. Now is the perfect time to get out and consider moving it. Anywhere from the very end of October all the way through to the middle parts of March is the perfect time to move everything in the garden, especially roses. Bare root rose season is here, and many people that are new to gardening will often look at these very unattractive sticks with roots attached to them and wonder whether they will actually make any particular form or size in the years to come, and I can assure you they really will. Plants grown in this form are not only cheaper, better for the environment as they require very little shipping and of course no pot or compost, but also get themselves established just as fast, if not better, than a pot-grown plant. And I'll be creating loads of media over the next couple of weeks of exactly how these plants should be handled, all the way through from rehydrating them and then planting them and aftercare in the garden. All EU and UK customers can now get up to 15% off online at David Austin Roses. Simply head to one of my multimedia platforms where you can find me using the handle _Gardener Ben and follow one of the links you'll find in my bio or one of my exclusive online discount codes. But for today, we're going to be talking about winterisation and the measures and procedures that you can put into place to protect especially your roses for the onslaught of the autumn and winter months ahead, especially if you're joining me from a growing zone outside of the UK, where you may experience really harsh winter temperatures. The winterisation process is normally very easy, and wherever possible I would advise caution to be taken, especially around pruning. I know most people are going to want to get out in the garden and tidy up what they feel to be mess, but it is after all a garden and a natural growing space. I tend to leave all of my herbaceous perennials up and standing well into the new year. These offer an amazing source of food to many garden visitors, including birds, voles and mice. You'll also find plenty of interest with the roses as they produce a multitude of different colours, shapes and sizes of hips, which can not only make the garden look incredibly beautiful, but can be brought into the house and used for a whole host of different things. From making your own rose hip tea, to also making fruit jams and jellies with them. For the winterisation process, you're going to have to cherry pick the different parts of this particular advice by hand depending on your growing season. Part of climate change has meant that the garden has become a very unpredictable place, and the weather, especially here on the south coast of England, is very changeable. One day we can be at plus 14 degrees and everything can be very happily growing away, green and still very tender. The next we're plunged into -8 and everything is black and almost dead. So I found by taking a few basic precautions that we can protect the garden plants and prepare them for the onslaught of the autumn and winter months. The first thing to do is to consider tying in any climbing roses you're growing. Now is certainly not the time of year to be pruning these items. There will still be a few flowers to be had, but it's best to get these long straggly canes tied in where they're safe. I'm not a fan of using plastic cable ties or flexi tie. Instead, I tend to use Hessian twine. This normally rots within around 8 to 10 months, and it's normally at the time of year that you're working your way back to the roses to take them off of their structures and prune them again in the autumn and winter months. So do tie in any long growth, especially if they're close to windows, doorways, or if you have an arbour over a path or patio. With shrub roses, I find it best to go round and just shorten the canes and leaders ever so slightly, normally by around a third. This is normally only something that's done for large specimens, such as the lark ascending, Gertrude Jekyll, or maybe the Queen of Sweden, which gets quite tall. By simply shortening the stems back by around a third, you can take a little bit of the winter root rock out of them. Now, this is always a very difficult one to say, especially when you're filming live content, but this normally involves the plant being whipped around by high autumn winds. In the wet and the rain, this can often lead to problems with the root systems, causing damage and ultimately the plant to rot. So just by removing around a third of the heavy growth, you can take a little bit of the whip out of the plant and just make sure it doesn't rock around too much. If you have a large specimen, for instance the lark ascending, which here in my garden reaches well over 7 or 8 feet, consider adding some supports. Normally I do this in March and April, and I normally use cast iron sight pins and tie the canes quite closely to those. Over the summer months, these particular supports completely disappear, and they're normally only visible towards the end of October, November, and through the winter months. Obviously, it's completely up to you, but I would always advise leaving all of the hips on the roses until they're fully mature, ripe. You'll often think that they're turning to mush in the garden and no longer attractive, but this is the stage that the birds and the mice will find the most appealing, and they know exactly when everything is exactly ripe and ready to eat. If, like me, you're growing roses in pots, it's time to start thinking about removing the water-retaining sources from underneath of them. These are essential during the summer months to make sure that your roses have as much water as they need and avoid stress, which ultimately avoids things like black spot, mould and mildew. The pots should be lifted up off the ground wherever possible and placed either onto bricks or pot feet. This makes sure that the pot has the maximum amount of drainage over the months to come, not only stopping the roots rotting within the pot and compost itself, but also protect your precious terracotta or glazed pots from the elements. By getting them up off the patio or paving and placing them on pot feet, you create an air gap underneath, meaning they drain much better and hopefully should not crack or get damaged during the cold winter months. Now, if you're growing somewhere particularly cold, you may need to also start thinking about bringing your pots in. I know many of my followers who join me from America find this is something that has to be done quite essentially. Once your plants have been frosted off and taken the first couple of frosts of the season, you can consider bringing them into the lee of a building, tuck them out of the worst and coldest of the winter winds, or into an outbuilding with a decent window that remains frost-free during the winter months. If you're not able to do this, or your pots are too large, you can consider actually wrapping the pot itself in some fleece or a 100% cotton cloth or hessian. Just simply drape this around the pot and tie it on with some hessian twine to protect the rootstock from the worst of the winter weather. Now the summer is over, there's little or no use for the watering systems, so I turn these off and drain them down, taking off the end caps wherever possible so there's not water sat in the hoses over the winter months. You may at this point as well, especially if you're growing somewhere cold, want to consider adding a protective mulch. Now this is slightly different to a decorative mulch or something that you might place into the garden to improve the soil, suppress the weeds or lock in moisture. At this time of year you want to choose something with a large particle size. Something like a landscaper's bark or homemade compost is really good. You can also use homemade leaf mulch if you have some available. Simply heap a large amount around the bottom of the plant. Now, advice on this matter has changed greatly over the last few years, and the suggestion is now that the graft point of the rose is now placed not above ground as it was before, but now below ground by around 2 or 3 inches. You can still do this technique wherever your graft point may be, whether you've placed it below ground or whether you've placed it underground. Simply add your mulch around the plant to a depth of around 6 to 8 inches and a diameter of around 18 inches. Heap the mulch up around the stems, and this will protect them from the worst of the winter weather. And because it has a large particle size, trapping large amounts of air, it will act as a nice warm blanket during the cold winter months. If you experience temperatures that are particularly harsh, this can just protect the stems and mean the plant doesn't die back to ground level, leaving you something to work with in the spring months when it comes to pruning. When the spring finally arrives, this mulch can simply be peeled back and added to the rest of the border before you assess your plants and carry out your spring pruning. And of course, I'll be creating lots of content over the coming weeks and months on this subject too. My advice is always to leave just as much growth on the plant as possible over the winter months. Let nature take its course, and once you've reduced the growth by up to a third to protect it from root rot, just simply allow the plant to go dormant. If you've had any pest or disease problems during the growing season that's just passed, make sure you clear any fallen debris from around your roses, especially if you've had mould or black spot. These leaves need to head to the garden incinerator or off for commercial recycling. Please don't place these in your domestic compost bin, as it's very unlikely that your compost bin will reach temperatures high enough to clear the pathogens and spores, and you may introduce them to the garden at another time. Instead, these leaves should be placed in the incinerator, burnt wherever possible, or as say sent off for commercial recycling, where compost has to reach a certain temperature for it to be cleared for production. If you have any queries or questions regarding the winterisation process of your garden, and specifically roses, don't hesitate to drop me a comment below, or you can always watch the full tutorial on any one of my social media platforms. You can find me using the handle _gardenerben across Instagram, TikTok, YouTube and Facebook. The other thing I absolutely adore about the autumn season is the final crops. It's time to harvest apples and go pumpkin picking. I grew loads of different varieties this year in the garden, 4 in total, but it's simply not enough for the displays that we would like to create on the porch. So this weekend we're off pumpkin picking, and we will be bringing home wheelbarrows full of pumpkins to display in our porch. Over the coming weeks and heading towards Christmas, I'll slowly but surely select these and bring them into the house for cooking, creating a multitude of really lovely autumn and winter dishes. We'll make a lovely pumpkin mac and cheese, where the pumpkin flesh is roasted and added to the cheese sauce. Also a lovely pumpkin pie, and of course everybody's winter favourite, pumpkin, sweet potato and parsnip soup, which is a firm favourite here. In the garden this week, it's also time to change over the seasonal bedding. I try not to use too many seasonal plants wherever possible, but of course there's always places in the garden where you want massive amounts of colour, and nothing does that more than bedding plants. So there's a few key pieces in the garden and large pots that need to be changed over, and a hanging basket or two that need to be emptied out. To keep things as interesting as possible, I like to plant a multitude of different bedding plants in my seasonal planters, and for the autumn and winter make sure that I underplant them with as many different types of bulbs as possible. Many gardeners will call this a bulb lasagna, but I simply call it preparing for every single season. The bedding plants will carry the planter all the way through the winter months, offering you colour and interest, normally by your front or back door. The bulbs planted will often just come through in February, March and April, and carry the pot through to the end of May, when it's time to change over everything again. For the autumn and winter months, I'll be planting on the top levels of my pots, mixed polyanthus. Now I do actually prefer a primrose, but here in the UK, where it can be particularly wet, the primrose without its flower stalk can unfortunately get quite wet and mushy. The blooms are held very close to the ground, and because it rains here an awful lot, they get splashed by large droplets of water, often turning them to completely mulch. However, the polyanthus, which is the more modern cultivar, has a stalk, bearing its stems normally around 3 or 4 inches above ground level, meaning they're much more dependable when it comes to our changing English weather. I'll be planting polyanthus in pink, blue and white, and surrounding them with forget-me-nots. double white and rose-coloured bellis, which is a modern cultivar of the daisy you'll find in your lawn. I'll also be planting some sweet williams, which are a firm cottage garden favourite, which I love to grow to make sure I have plenty of flowers to cut and bring into the house come April and May. I'll be pairing these with the traditional forget-me-not and adding a few bedding cyclamen just to give a real punch of colour right now. I like to keep the bulbs in my pots simple, adding just a couple of varieties at a time, often colour coordinating tulips which I'll hold off planting until we've had a really decent first frost. But there's no reason why you can't go ahead now and plant dwarf daffodils and dwarf crocuses. I even add these items to my hanging baskets to make sure I have a really good show come a few weeks' time. Once these bulbs have been spent, I raise them, dry them out in crates, and then in the autumn add them to the tapestry of bulbs planted underneath the spring lawn and in the wildflower meadow. So nothing goes to waste and everything gets a second chance. Don't forget, if you're reusing compost for your autumn and winter planters, make sure that you inspect it thoroughly and make sure that you're not carrying pest and disease problems forward into the winter, as vine weevil grubs especially absolutely adore the root systems of polyanthus and primrose and completely devastate your pots if left unattended. Although it seems to have been raining here in the UK for what seems to be like forever, we obviously haven't had the weather that a lot of places in the world have. So I'll be making sure that I keep on top of the general maintenance of the garden and most importantly paying attention to the lawn. Most problems that you experience with your domestic lawn can be avoided by continuing your maintenance through into the autumn and winter months, and you can avoid having to do heavy remedial work in the spring and summer if you just keep going with your lawnmower and make sure that you clear the debris from the lawn wherever possible. Fallen leaves and twigs need to be removed just as soon as possible. From a micro level, a leaf can actually completely obliterate and block out the sun. If left in large piles or a covering of leaves across the lawn, you can actually completely block out the sun, meaning the lawn will go yellow very quickly, causing to large patches of dieback, which ultimately will have to be reseeded next year. So wherever the weather is fine enough, get out and make sure that you keep your lawn under control. Don't retire the lawnmower just yet, and as long as the ground is not sodden or the grass is not frozen, you can make sure that you can get out and mow the lawn. I always increase the height of cut on the lawnmower ever so slightly, just by a click or two. And if your lawn is particularly wet, try and keep your children and pets off of it wherever possible. This will also stop the ground becoming compacted and causing drainage problems. At this time of year, you can also consider adding an autumn weed feed and moss kill to the lawn, just to give it a good bolster and the nutritional value it needs to harden it up for the winter months ahead. I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of the Gardener Ben podcast. Next week, I'm incredibly excited to bring you my first invited guest. I'm going to be chatting to Jeff, known as the Rose Dude. You can find him operating his platforms across Instagram, TikTok and YouTube. Jeff is from America and I've been following him for a long time. Like me, he has a huge passion for roses, and more importantly, he is a home and domestic rose hybridizer, talking extensively on his channels about how you can cross-pollinate roses, creating your own varieties at home, how you can save the seeds and then plant them next season to create seedlings, which you can then in turn cross with other varieties that you've grown, creating the perfect rose that captures your attention. I'm really excited to talk to Jeff next week, and I hope that you join us too. Head over to his Instagram, TikTok or YouTube channel now and give him a follow. You'll find him using the handle The Rose Dude. Once again, thank you for joining me for episode 3 of the Gardener Ben podcast. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I will see you all again very soon. Take good care now and happy gardening.